Adrian Cole was a man who, to the outside world, had everything anyone could dream of. His name carried weight in boardrooms across the globe, his signature could change the fate of companies overnight, and his sprawling estate was a palace of glass and steel perched high above the city skyline. Yet behind the polished gates, there was a silence that not even the most expensive chandelier could brighten. It wasn't always this way. Just a year ago, Adrian's life had been filled with laughter and love. His wife, Elena, had been the anchor to his storm, a gentle counterbalance to his relentless drive for success. But happiness had a cruel way of slipping through his fingers. The day Liam, their son, was born, Adrian lost the love of his life. Complications during childbirth took Elena away before she could even hold their baby. From that moment, Adrian's world changed forever. The months that followed were a blur of grief and responsibility. Adrian threw himself deeper into his work, perhaps as a way to avoid facing the empty side of his bed, or the fact that his son was growing without the warmth of a mother's embrace. He hired the best nannies money could buy, but they came and went like seasonal staff, efficient, but never truly connected to Liam. Then came Maria. She didn't arrive with polished references or an elite childcare resume. In fact, she was originally hired as a housemaid. But from the first day she stepped into the mansion, something about her was different. She moved quietly but with purpose, her dark hair always neatly tied back, her voice soft and steady. More than that, she seemed to understand Liam in a way no one else did. Adrian first noticed it on a rainy afternoon. The baby had been crying for hours, his wails echoing through the cavernous halls. Adrian, frustrated and exhausted from a long meeting, stormed into the nursery ready to call the nanny to account. But instead, he found Maria, sitting in the corner with Liam tucked against her chest, humming an unfamiliar tune in a language Adrian didn't know. The moment she sang, Liam's cries softened into hiccups, and within minutes, he was fast asleep. That was the first time Adrian felt something. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a reminder of a tenderness he thought had died with Elena. Still, he kept his distance. In his mind, Maria was simply good help, competent, caring, but part of the staff nonetheless. His life was too complicated for anything else. But even from the shadows, he couldn't ignore the changes in his son. Liam began to smile more. His tiny hands reached out when Maria entered the room. He laughed, not the polite, brief chuckles he gave to strangers, but deep, belly laughs only she seemed to coax from him. The mansion's atmosphere began to shift, too. Where there had been cold silence, there was now the sound of lullabies drifting through the air, the soft patter of Maria's footsteps, the faint smell of warm milk and fresh laundry. Adrian told himself it was nothing, just the result of good childcare, but part of him knew better. Adrian's own schedule, however, left little time for this quiet transformation. His days began before sunrise and ended well past midnight, filled with investor calls, corporate dinners, and endless negotiations. It wasn't unusual for him to go days without more than a quick goodnight glance at Liam in his crib. But whenever he did take a rare break and wander into the nursery, he almost always found Maria there, not just doing her job, but caring in a way that felt almost maternal. Still, the boundaries between employer and employee were unspoken but firm. Adrian didn't pry into her life, and she didn't volunteer details. Their conversations were brief, professional. Yet sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, Maria would glance at him with an expression he couldn't read, part sadness, part gratitude, part something else entirely. And so, the days rolled on. Adrian continued living in his two worlds, the public one, full of success and power, and the private one, where a quiet maid kept his home warm and his son happy. He didn't yet realize that these worlds were on a collision course, that a single unexpected moment would shatter the fragile balance and force both him and Maria to confront secrets that could change their lives forever. For now, Adrian believed he was in control. He believed the order of his life was unshakable. But fate, as always, had other plans, and those plans were about to unfold in the very heart of his home. It was a Thursday afternoon when it happened, the moment that would change everything. Adrian had just finished an intense negotiation downtown. The deal had gone better than expected, and he found himself with a few unexpected free hours. For most men, that meant rest. For Adrian, it meant something rare, a chance to see his son in the middle of the day. The city traffic crawled under the gray skies, but Adrian hardly noticed. His mind was already picturing Liam, maybe awake in his crib, maybe gurgling in delight at one of his toys. A small smile tugged at his lips. He couldn't remember the last time he had surprised his boy like this. When he finally reached the mansion, the gates swung open and the guards greeted him with the usual nod. Inside, the house was quieter than usual. No clinking of dishes from the kitchen. No vacuum hum from the hallways. Just silence, broken only by the faintest sound. A soft, melodic humming. Adrian frowned, his polished shoes clicking on the marble floor as he followed the sound. It was coming from the nursery upstairs. The tune was unfamiliar, but it was tender, almost like a lullaby. Each step closer made the humming clearer, until he could hear the gentle creak of the nursery's rocking chair. He stopped at the half-open door. At first, the scene inside looked almost ordinary, Maria sitting in the wooden chair by the window, sunlight spilling across her face. Liam was nestled in her arms, his tiny hand clutching the edge of her blouse. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and peaceful. But then Adrian's gaze fell lower, and his breath caught. Maria's blouse was loosened, and Liam was latched to her, nursing. The sight froze him in place. His mind didn't process it all at once, first confusion, then shock, then a wave of emotions he couldn't even name. This wasn't just a maid cradling a baby. This was something intimate, something deeply personal. He stepped inside, his voice low but sharp. "Maria, what are you doing?" Maria's head jerked up. Her dark eyes widened, and a flush of panic swept across her face. "Sir, she glanced down at Liam, then back up at Adrian. "Please. I can explain." But Adrian's voice had already hardened. "Explain? You think there's an explanation for this? In my house? With my son?" The words hung in the air like a blade. Liam stirred slightly but didn't cry, still secure in Maria's arms. The rocking chair continued its slow, steady creak, as if mocking the tension between them. Maria's lips trembled. "I didn't mean to overstep, sir. He was crying so much that day, and the nanny wasn't around." "That doesn't give you the right," Adrian snapped. His voice was quieter now, but more dangerous. "You're here to work, not," he stopped himself. His own words felt strange in his mouth. He didn't even know how to finish the sentence without sounding cruel. Maria's hands tightened protectively around Liam. She looked down at him, her face softening for a brief moment, then lifted her gaze back to Adrian. "It wasn't about my rights, sir. It was about his needs." Her tone wasn't defiant, but it wasn't apologetic either. There was a weight in her voice that made Adrian pause, just for a second, before the irritation returned. "His needs?" Adrian repeated. "He has formula. He has bottles. He has everything money can buy. He doesn't need." Maria cut in softly, almost whispering, "He needed comfort." The quiet conviction in her voice unnerved him. He wanted to demand she put Liam down immediately, to call the head of staff and have her replaced by morning. But something in the way she looked at the child, and something about the peace on Liam's tiny face, kept him rooted to the spot. For a moment, Adrian wasn't the billionaire CEO. He wasn't the master of the house. He was just a father, staring at the woman who, somehow, had calmed his son in a way he never could. Still, the questions swirled in his mind. Why was she doing this? Was this something she had done before? How long had this been happening without his knowledge? Maria seemed to sense the storm behind his eyes. "Please, sir," she said quietly. "Just, Let me explain everything before you decide. Adrian's jaw tightened. He hated losing control of a situation, and this, whatever this was, had completely blindsided him. His instinct was to shut it down immediately. Yet there was another part of him, the part he buried under work and walls, that needed to hear her out. Finally, he stepped forward and gestured toward the crib. Put him down first. Maria nodded and rose slowly, her movements gentle so as not to wake Liam. She laid him in the crib, tucking the blanket around him, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. He made a soft, contented sigh in his sleep. Then she turned back to Adrian, her hands clasped in front of her, eyes lowered. I'll tell you the truth, sir. All of it. Adrian didn't answer right away. His gaze flicked between her and the sleeping child. His mind was already bracing for whatever revelation was coming, though he could not yet guess just how much her story would change everything he thought he knew about her, and about himself. The nursery felt heavy with silence after Liam drifted back into sleep. Adrian stood near the crib, his arms folded, his eyes fixed on Maria with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably. You said you would explain, he said at last, his voice calm but edged with suspicion. I suggest you start now. Maria's gaze remained on the floor for a moment, as if searching for the courage to begin. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, trembling, not from fear of Adrian, but from something deeper. Before I came here, sir, I had a child. Adrian's brow furrowed. He had never asked much about her life before working in his home. She had always been quiet, private, which suited him fine. But this? He hadn't expected this. Maria swallowed hard, her fingers tightening together. Her name was Sophia. She was only 3 months old when she stopped, her lips pressing together as if to hold back a flood of emotion. When she died. The words landed like a stone between them. Adrian felt an unfamiliar pang in his chest. How? He asked quietly. Maria's eyes glistened. She was born early, too early. The doctors did what they could, but her lungs, they weren't strong enough. She fought so hard, sir. Every day I prayed over her crib. Every day I told her stories and sang her to sleep, hoping she would grow strong enough to stay. But one night, her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her mouth before continuing. One night, she just stopped breathing. Adrian didn't move. He had known grief, the kind that steals the air from your lungs and leaves you empty. Elena's death had done that to him. But to lose a child. Maria took a shaky breath. After Sophia died, I thought I would never be whole again. I left my home, my job, everything reminded me of her. When I saw your ad for a housemaid position, I applied because I needed work that would keep me busy. I didn't want to think. I didn't want to feel. Her eyes lifted to meet his. Then I met Liam. Adrian's chest tightened at the sound of his son's name on her lips. The first time I held him, sir, he was crying, and the nanny had gone to answer the phone. I asked if I could help, and she handed him to me. The moment I felt his little body in my arms, something in me shifted. It was like holding a piece of my Sophia again. She smiled faintly at the memory, though her eyes still shimmered with tears. That day, he was fussy, nothing seemed to calm him. And then I realized, my body was still producing milk. The doctors had told me it might happen for a while after losing Sophia. I don't know what came over me, sir. I wasn't thinking about rules or lines I shouldn't cross. I was only thinking about the tiny baby in my arms, hungry and crying, and how I had the ability to give him comfort. So. I did. Adrian's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I told myself it would be only that one time, Maria went on. But the days passed, and sometimes it just happened again. Always when the nanny wasn't around, always when Liam was inconsolable. It wasn't about replacing bottles or ignoring your instructions. It was about soothing him. And maybe, her voice faltered, softer now. Maybe it was also about soothing myself. Holding him, feeding him, it made me feel like a mother again, just for a little while. The confession hung in the air, raw and unpolished. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception. But there was none. Her story wasn't calculated. It wasn't a performance. It was pain, real, unfiltered pain, stitched together with moments of instinctive love. "You should have told me," Adrian said at last. His voice lacked the earlier anger, but it carried the weight of someone who still felt blindsided. "I know," Maria said softly. "I was afraid you'd misunderstand. Afraid you'd take him away from me entirely. Anne. I couldn't bear that." There was no sound in the nursery except Liam's soft breathing. Adrian's gaze drifted to the crib. His son's tiny chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling between the adults in the room. Adrian turned back to Maria. "You understand that what you did, it's not something most people would accept." "I understand," she said. "And if you want me to leave, I will. But before you decide, I need you to know. I love him, sir. Not because you pay me to. Not because it's my job. I love him like he's mine. And I would never, never, harm him." Something in her tone made Adrian's throat tighten. He could see it now, every time she had held Liam, every lullaby she had sung, every smile she had coaxed from him, it wasn't duty. It was love. The kind of love you can't buy. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Adrian stepped toward the crib, looking down at his sleeping son. His hand rested lightly on the rail, fingers tapping once before he spoke. "I need time to think," he said finally. Maria nodded, lowering her gaze. "Of course, sir." Adrian turned to leave, but just before stepping out, he paused. His voice was quieter this time. "I'm sorry for your loss." Maria's lips trembled, but she didn't reply. She simply gave a small nod and stood by the crib, watching over Liam as Adrian's footsteps faded down the hall. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was not the end of the conversation, only the beginning of a bond that would test everything they thought they understood about family, trust, and love. The days after Maria's confession were different. Adrian didn't fire her, though part of him felt he should have. But something in her story had lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. He couldn't stop thinking about the way her voice had cracked when she spoke of her daughter, or how Liam's tiny face had looked so peaceful in her arms. Still, he kept his distance. He told himself he was simply observing her, making sure nothing else happened without his knowledge. But the truth was, every time he passed the nursery and heard her singing, he found himself slowing down, listening for just a few seconds longer. Maria, for her part, seemed to respect the invisible line that had been drawn. She was careful, always using bottles now, never crossing boundaries. But the tenderness in the way she cared for Liam never changed. If anything, it deepened, and Adrian noticed. One evening, a week after the incident, Adrian returned home earlier than usual. The house was quiet except for a faint sound coming from upstairs. Curious, he followed it to the nursery, but this time, the door was wide open. Maria was sitting on the floor, her legs crossed, Liam propped up against a pile of pillows. They were playing with brightly colored stacking rings. Liam giggled each time Maria pretended to lose the top ring and searched for it under the wrong pillow. Adrian leaned quietly against the doorframe, unseen. He watched as Maria clapped softly when Liam successfully stacked two rings together. She didn't praise him in an exaggerated, sing-song tone like so many hired caregivers did. Her encouragement was warm, genuine. For the first time in a long while, Adrian realized his son was happy, not just cared for, but truly happy. Maria spotted him then. She smiled, not startled, but acknowledging his presence. "You're home early, sir." "Meeting ended sooner than I thought," Adrian replied, stepping inside. He crouched beside Liam, who reached out a tiny hand toward his father's face. "Hi, buddy," Adrian murmured, brushing his son's cheek with his thumb. He glanced at Maria. "He's laughing more these days." Maria nodded, her eyes soft. "He's growing fast. Soon he'll be walking." Adrian's chest tightened, not with sadness, but with the realization of how much he had been missing. For so long, his focus had been on running his empire, thinking it was the best way to secure Liam's future. But what about the present? Over the next several days, he found himself coming home earlier whenever possible. Sometimes he joined Maria and Liam during playtime, other times he simply watched, learning the small rituals she had with his son, the songs, the silly faces, the gentle way she held him after he fell asleep. The staff began to notice, too. Whispers drifted through the mansion's long corridors, the kind of quiet gossip that moves like smoke. "The boss is spending more time upstairs," they said. "With the maid and the baby." But Adrian ignored them. One rainy night, the bond between them shifted in a way neither could deny. Liam had been sick all day, a mild fever, nothing alarming, but enough to make him fussy and restless. Adrian had cancelled his dinner meeting and stayed home, but by evening, exhaustion was written all over his face. He had tried holding Liam, rocking him, even pacing the nursery, but nothing worked. "Here," Maria said softly, taking the baby from him. She sat in the rocking chair, humming that same unfamiliar lullaby Adrian had heard the day of the incident. Within minutes, Liam's cries softened, and he drifted into sleep against her shoulder. Adrian watched, leaning against the wall. "How do you do that?" he asked quietly. Maria glanced up at him. "Babies don't just hear you," she said. "They feel you. If you're calm, they feel safe." It was a small victory, but to Adrian, it felt monumental. From then on, a quiet understanding grew between them. Maria no longer avoided him, and Adrian no longer looked at her with suspicion. Instead, they began to share small conversations, about Liam, about the weather, about the food in the kitchen. And sometimes, about more personal things. One afternoon, while Liam napped, Adrian found Maria in the kitchen arranging flowers in a vase. "You like flowers?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "They remind me of my mother's garden back home. She used to grow sunflowers taller than me." Adrian chuckled. "I can't picture you in a garden. You seem too practical." Maria tilted her head. "Practical people need beauty too, sir. Otherwise, what are we working for?" The question lingered in his mind long after he left the room. The walls between them were lowering, brick by brick. Not through grand gestures, but through moments, the kind you only notice when you look back and realize the distance you once kept has vanished. By the time winter rolled around, Adrian was no longer the distant father who popped in between meetings. He was there for Liam's first clumsy steps across the nursery rug. He was there for the baby's first real word, "Dada," spoken one morning while Maria was pouring cereal in the kitchen. That night, Adrian stood at the window of his study, watching the snowfall blanket the garden. Maria passed by, carrying Liam to bed, and for a fleeting second, the image struck him, the soft light on her face, the way Liam rested against her as if he belonged nowhere else. It felt like home. But not everyone would see it that way. And Adrian knew, deep down, that sooner or later, the whispers in the hallways and the unspoken questions would demand an answer. He just didn't know that moment was coming much sooner than he thought. The night of the gala was unlike any other at the Cole mansion. Crystal chandeliers glittered above the grand ballroom, casting golden light across polished marble floors. The air buzzed with chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the rustle of silk gowns. It was an evening meant to celebrate the success of Adrian's latest business venture, another empire-shaping deal that would make headlines the next morning. The city's most powerful figures were present, investors, politicians, socialites, and journalists eager for a quote. Adrian stood near the head of the room, dressed in a sleek black suit that fit him like armor. He looked every bit the billionaire host, confident, polished, untouchable. Yet beneath the exterior, his heart was restless. For weeks, he had wrestled with the truth. Maria's confession about her lost daughter, the bond she had formed with Liam, and the changes he himself had felt, they haunted him. Each night, when he checked on his son, he saw more than just a child thriving under her care, he saw a family he hadn't known he was missing. And tonight, he had made a decision. The music softened as the orchestra paused. Waiters stopped mid-step, and the crowd turned as Adrian moved toward the center of the ballroom. A microphone was placed in his hand. He had given countless speeches in his life, but this time was different. His palms felt heavier, not from nerves, but from the weight of what he was about to say. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his deep voice carrying easily across the vast room. "Thank you for being here to celebrate another milestone for Cole Enterprises. But tonight, I have something more personal to share." The crowd leaned in. Reporters raised their phones, sensing news worth capturing. Adrian's gaze swept across the room, then found Maria at the edge of the ballroom. She wasn't in her maid's uniform tonight. Instead, at his request, she wore a simple navy blue dress that highlighted her quiet grace. Liam was in her arms, dressed in a tiny white suit, his big eyes blinking curiously at the crowd. Gasps rippled through the guests as Adrian walked toward them. Whispers followed. "Why is she here?" "That's the maid, isn't it?" Adrian stopped beside Maria and rested a steady hand on her shoulder. His voice firmed. "Some of you may recognize this woman. Maria has been in my home, not just as a maid, but as someone who has cared for my son with more love and devotion than anyone could have expected. And tonight, I want the world to know the truth." A hush fell over the crowd. Adrian glanced down at Liam, then back at Maria, whose eyes glistened with uncertainty. He drew a breath. "Maria is no longer just the maid in my house. From this day forward, she is Liam's official guardian, and soon, she will be my wife." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, even sharp whispers echoed like thunder. Some guests looked shocked, others outraged, a few even disgusted. A billionaire marrying a maid? Impossible. But amid the chaos, Adrian stood unshaken, his hand never leaving Maria's shoulder. Maria's eyes widened, her lips parting as though she couldn't believe the words she had just heard. "Sir." "Adrian, are you sure?" she whispered, her voice trembling so softly only he could hear. Adrian turned to her, his expression softer than the crowd had ever seen. "I've never been more certain of anything. You gave my son something money couldn't buy. You gave him love. And you gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever, a home." Tears filled Maria's eyes, and she clutched Liam closer. The baby let out a small giggle, unaware of the storm of emotions around him, his tiny hands reaching toward Adrian. A journalist shouted from the corner, "Mr. Cole, is this some kind of charity gesture?" Adrian's eyes sharpened. "Charity?" His voice rang with authority. "This woman is not charity. She is strength, sacrifice, and love. If you think money is the only measure of worth, then you've learned nothing about life." The crowd fell silent. For a long, charged moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, a few guests began to clap. At first, it was hesitant, scattered. But then the applause grew, spreading through the ballroom until the sound filled every corner of the hall. Some still whispered, others shook their heads, but the moment was undeniable. Adrian slipped his arm around Maria as the applause swelled. She looked up at him, her cheeks wet with tears, and whispered, "Thank you, for choosing me." He leaned closer, his voice low, tender. "No, Maria. Thank you, for choosing us." From that night forward, everything changed. The newspapers exploded with headlines: "Billionaire marries his maid, Adrian Cole shocks the city with bold announcement, from housekeeper to heiress." Some mocked, others romanticized, but none ignored it. Adrian, however, paid no attention to the noise. For once in his life, public opinion didn't matter. What mattered was that Liam woke up each morning to the same soothing lullabies. What mattered was the laughter echoing through the once empty halls of the mansion. What mattered was the family they were building together, piece by piece, healing old wounds with new love. It wasn't the story Adrian had planned for his life. But it was the story he had been given. And in the end, it was better than any plan wealth or power could have secured. For the first time in years, the billionaire wasn't lonely. He wasn't just surviving loss. He was living again, with Maria by his side and Liam in his arms. And that night, as he carried his son upstairs while Maria walked beside him, Adrian knew this truth deep in his heart. Sometimes the most unexpected choices lead to the most beautiful endings.